When people hear the words green label in the CGC world, there's almost an instant emotional reaction because for a lot of collectors, the green label has earned a reputation as something to avoid at all costs. And today I want to slow that conversation down a little bit and talk honestly about when a green label comic makes sense, and when it absolutely does not, and why nuance actually matters here. The CGC green label, officially called a qualified label, exists to flag a very specific issue with a comic that goes beyond normal wear and tear. And that's why it carries so much baggage in the market. Because unlike a blue label that reflects age and handling, a green label is basically CGC saying, look, this book has a major caveat that you need to understand before you buy it. One of the most common reasons a book receives a green label is because of an unauthenticated signature, meaning the comic is signed by someone important, but the signature was not witnessed by a CGC representative. So instead of getting the yellow signature series label, it gets marked as qualified. And that alone is enough to turn many collectors away, even if the signature itself is legitimate. And I get it, because if you've got a book and somebody's name's written on it, but you don't know if that signature really was written by the individual whose name that it is, I get it. I get not wanting to have something like that. Another major reason green labels exist is missing inclusions or components. Things like Marvel value stamps, cutout coupons, tattoos, mail-away inserts, or anything that was originally part of the book but has since been removed. And CGC considers that book incomplete regardless of how nice the rest of it looks. Now, something like that to me would not bother me at all. And I know plenty of people that it doesn't bother either. But again, we would need to consider the book. I'm going to get into that in a minute, but I want to continue defining this so we all understand. These labels, they can also be assigned for significant defects or damage that goes beyond typical grading considerations like detached covers, detached pages, structural issues within the book that could materially affect the book. And then you have married copies. And for those of you that have never heard about a book being married or don't know what it is, it's where a cover from one comic is used to replace the missing cover on another copy. And CGC flags that immediately with a green label because the book might look complete, but it's no longer original in its construction. And so there are even rare cases where error books or manufacturing quirks get noted with a green label as well. But the bigger takeaway there is that the label exists to warn buyers that there is a specific issue that needs to be understood and not glossed over. And so because of that, as you can probably imagine, green labels almost always trade at a discount compared to blue labels of the same grade. And in the marketplace, they're known as the label of death. And that's especially among collectors who know how hard they can be to move. But this is where context becomes everything. Because while I'm generally very cautious on green labels, especially for investment purposes, I don't believe all green labels are created equal at all. And this is where a lot of collectors either make really smart moves or really expensive mistakes. And so I'm going to make this easy on you because we're going to start with a hard no. And that's Bronze and Silver Age comic books. Because for those eras, green labels almost never make sense from a portfolio standpoint. Silver Age and Bronze Age books exist in enough quantity that you do not need to compromise. And when you buy a green label copy of something like a major Silver Age key, you're often paying real money for a book that will always be harder to sell, harder to upgrade, and harder to explain to the next buyer. If a Bronze or Silver Age book has a missing Marvel value stamp or an unauthenticated signature or detached cover or something like that, you're just better off waiting. Just don't buy it. Save. You'd honestly be better off buying a lower grade blue label copy instead, because the market has shown over and over again that clean blue labels outperform qualified copies, period. Full stop. That's the hard and fast rule here. And not only that, there's no shortage of Silver Age keys and blue labels anyways. And so when supply exists, compromise is rarely rewarded. But as was the case with some of my other segments, particularly the purple label segment, the conversation changes dramatically when we move into Golden Age territory, because Golden Age comics live in a completely different universe than everything else in this hobby when it comes to scarcity, survivability, and accessibility. And so for certain Golden Age books, green labels are not just acceptable, but they are sometimes the only realistic entry point into ownership at all. And I'm talking about Flash 1, All-American 16, Superman 1, Action 1, Batman 1. I could go on. These are books that you can't always simply wait around to find in clean blue labels unless you have an unlimited budget and unlimited patience. And in those cases, a green label can represent opportunity and not compromise. I would be fine, depending on the book, I would be fine with it. Depending on why I got the label and depending on the book, I'm not going to turn down an Action 1 with a green label. So the point is that in those cases, a green label can represent opportunity, not compromise, but only if you understand exactly why that book is qualified. And you should. Because an unauthenticated signature on a Golden Age key is very different than a missing Marvel value stamp on a Bronze Age book. Because Golden Age signatures often come from a time when witness programs didn't even exist. And historic signatures weren't even documented in a modern grading context. So some of these things, there's no real way to know. And in that situation, some collectors can be very comfortable buying a green label copy with an unverified sig, especially if the book itself is structurally intact and the signature doesn't detract from the book's presentation or historical importance. And it's the kind of sig. I mean, if there's, magic marker scribble all over the thing, I mean, so much of this is a case-by-case basis. And to that end, certain Golden Age books may have missing or replaced components that are almost unavoidable given their age. And the market tends to be far more forgiving of that as well, because the alternative is often not owning the book at all. This hobby's been going on for a long time. I mean, some of the stuff, it just happened. It is what it is. And so that said, even in Golden Age, green labels still demand serious consideration because not all qualifiers are considered equal. And this is where discipline matters, because a green label caused by a married cover, major structural damage, or severe alterations even, should still give you some pause, even on iconic books, because while rarity can't justify the compromise, it does not erase liquidity risk. And I think a key thing to understand is how green labels compare to purple labels, because you might be sitting there wondering, well, which one is better, which one is worse if I had to pick, because obviously both are considered less desirable than blue, but with different implications. A purple label indicates restoration, meaning that the book has been actively altered to improve appearance or stability, and resto always carries a heavier stigma in the market, at least in my opinion. Whereas green labels, that indicates an issue of completeness, verification, rather than an alteration, rather than changing the book. And I think that's why many collectors would prefer a green label over a purple one if they had to pick between the two. I think for me, it really is a case-by-case basis for each, depending on what's going on and what book we're talking about, frankly. Now, neither label should be treated casually, and both of them require you to really think about not just buying the book, not just getting into the book, but getting out of it or selling it someday, if not you, your kids. I mean, eventually, you always have to think about that with comics. When you get in, and get out. Because if you're not the one to sell it, or your kids or your family or whatever, I mean, it's some point, it's going to be sold. And so that's where I always come back to intent, because the biggest mistake collectors make with green labels is buying emotionally and justifying it intellectually after the fact, after it's over. If you are buying a green label because it's the only way you can realistically own a historically significant golden age book, and you understand the qualifier, then that's a defensible decision. There's a lot of great books out there with green labels on them, and that's just facts. But on the other hand, if you're buying a green label because it feels cheaper in the moment, especially on books that exist in blue labels, you are almost always setting yourself up for frustration down the road. Green labels should not be considered by any means as automatic deals. They are conditional assets, and the condition is your understanding of why that label exists and how the market views it at large. And so the rule of thumb I live by is very simple. Green labels are an absolute no for Silver Age, Bronze, and anything below that. But they can make sense for select Golden Age grails where scarcity overrides purity, as long as the qualifier is understood and priced appropriately. And I can't emphasize that enough. I don't want to see any blue label pricing on a green label book. And so at the end of the day, Slabbed Portfolios is about collecting smarter, not louder, and green labels are one of those areas where restraint, patience, and context separate strong collections from regret purchases.